Hey everyone, John here! And yesterday, Microsoft made it official. 4 first-party Xbox games are going multi-platform. But what if I told you this is far from the first time? What if I told you since the debut of Xbox they have done this around 30 times? Would you believe me? Well, we're not counting anything prior to Xbox, so no Microsoft Pinball for the Game Boy Color, and no Microsoft Entertainment Pack containing Minesweeper. I just kind of wanted to mention those. I mean, they could come to NSO for all we know, but anyway, without further ado, let's talk about games such as this one right here. What are you doing on the PlayStation 2, Age of Empires 2?
And you may be thinking, this game exists? And in part of the world, yeah. This released in Europe in November 2nd of 2001, which was around a week before the launch of the North American Xbox, where this game did not release. In fact, Age of Empires 2 wouldn't come to another console until 2023 on the Xbox One and Series X. They really don't want you to know that this is a Microsoft game. The only mention of Microsoft is here. Can you see that? This was published by Konami, because I suppose publishing your own IP on a competing console is a bit of a bad look when you're just launching your new console. Despite that though, when you launch the game, the main menu very clearly and largely says Microsoft. And this is a very literal port of Age of Empires 2. They didn't really change anything. Even the inputs, you're just moving around a mouse on a screen, which is very difficult with a controller. In order to move the screen around, the mouse has to be on the edge of the screen, which is really tricky when you're maneuvering that with an analog stick. But thankfully, this version does support a USB mouse. And from there, it's basically the PC version of Age of Empires 2, but on the PS2. It looks good, it runs pretty well, it has all the content. This is just a good and confusing game that they released. Now, the Game Boy Advance was swimming in Microsoft games, and our first one here is Monster Truck Madness. This was a pretty popular series on MS-DOS published by Microsoft, and in fact, back on the N64, they did Monster Truck Madness 64, a port of Monster Truck Madness 2 from MS-DOS, and that cartridge has a big Microsoft logo on it. And Rockstar. This looks so strange. And while that game was still a pretty big deal, it does predate the Xbox launch cycle. Unlike the Game Boy Advance version of Monster Truck Madness, it even has a Microsoft Game Studio logo on the Game Boy Advance. It's wild. Now, Microsoft did something a ton in this era, and that's instead of publishing the games themselves, they looked to THQ, so the boxes wouldn't say Microsoft or Microsoft Game Studios, because that kind of muddied the message of what Xbox was trying to build. With that said, Microsoft didn't have a handheld, and so the GBA wasn't really seen as competition, and so many Xbox franchises found their way to the Game Boy Advance. Monster Truck Madness is a very impressive GBA game. You definitely get that tangible feeling of full 3D that many games on this system didn't quite achieve. The series is a strange mix of realistic feeling vehicles with more arcadey mechanics, so there's power-ups, but you're also trying to very carefully drive and think about the terrain and how it's going to affect your steering. It's a very cool game. But there's no music. The sub-objective is to play the quiet game. Silence, viewer. What's kind of crazy is to this day, Monster Truck Madness has only had console ports on Nintendo. Monster Truck Madness 64 and Monster Truck Madness on the GBA. That is the entire portfolio of non-PC Monster Truck Madness games. Odd! In this era, Microsoft acquired Rare, and so after Star Fox Adventures, the GameCube was barren of any Rare games. But with that said, Rare didn't stop making Nintendo games. The GBA was full of them. First up with the GBA ports of Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, and 3, and I have some mixed feelings about these ones. They're definitely a step up above the Game Boy Color port of Donkey Kong Country, but there's also a bunch of other problems introduced. Like many Game Boy Advance games, the colors are very saturated, incredibly bright, and this is so you can make them out on a standard Game Boy screen where there's no backlight and everything's just very dark and damp. But playing them today on a fully backlit display, they're a little bit uggo. And despite the screen ratio being a bit wider on the GBA, the vertical crunch is very much in order, making some platforming a little bit tricky, especially later on in the minecart sections. But with that said, DKC1 and DKC2 now have full-on intros, actual animated cutscenes before the game starts, and that's kinda wild. And DKC3 has an entirely different soundtrack, and is something that I quite prefer to the Super Nintendo version. There's also other mild adjustments, there's mini-games, you can save anywhere on the map. There's definitely value in these versions, but to this day I'd rather play the Super Nintendo ones. But what about the third Banjo game? There's a third Banjo game? Yeah! Banjo-Kazooie Gruntys Revenge. This was originally being developed for the Game Boy Color, but was too ambitious for the system, and was later moved to the GBA. Considering it was so far along, Microsoft just said, yeah, give the GBA an original Banjo game, why not? This takes place after Tooie kind of, where Grunty is stuck under a rock and she is dead. But a Mecha Grunty is built, and her spirit goes into the machine where she gets to live kind of within the robot Grunty. And she uses her newfound body to travel back in time, take Kazooie away, and go back to the first Banjo-Kazooie. But Banjo goes back in time too, and he's got to rescue Kazooie and stop Grunty from changing the past in order to create a better future. This is all to say that this is a plot that affects nothing. But do you play Banjo for the plot? I mean, there's probably someone out there who does. There's definitely some compromises to the gameplay in bringing Banjo to the GBA. It's a much slower game with not that much exploration, just kind of condensed into small environments, and that's fine for what it is. In fact, there were quite a few platforming mascots on the GBA that did this kind of isometric view. There were Spyro games, there was a Rayman game that was a sequel to 3. I mean, the style is fine, it's nothing crazy great, but it works for what it is. If you've gone all these years without Gruntys Revenge, you are missing out on an okay game. But Banjo didn't stop there, because there was Banjo Pilot. This originally started development as Diddy Kong Pilot. In fact, a build from 2003 leaked online that's fully playable, and not that much has changed from that build, to be honest, with Banjo Pilot. They've just kind of put in some Banjo characters, changed the backgrounds to look a bit more like Banjo locations, but otherwise, Diddy Kong Pilot and Banjo Pilot were the exact same game. Despite everyone being in planes, this is a very traditional kart racer. It's not really like Diddy Kong Racing at all. If you go off the road, you slow down like a kart would. It's basically just a kart racer, but with a y-axis. You've got not mushrooms, not Koopa shells, not banana peels. It's a very original racer that's just kind of okay. There are some quite fun boss battles though, where you kind of take turns who's in the front and who's in the back, so you've got to be offensive and then you've got to be defensive. It's a pretty fun twist on a kind of battle mode. Definitely didn't cause waves, but Banjo Pilot is a fun, inoffensive Banjo game, and just like Gruntys Revenge, is something that all Banjo fans should at least try. Now, here's an interesting game, Saberwolf. This is kind of a reimagining of the original Saberwolf that Rare made on the ZX Spectrum back in the 1980s. The wolf basically goes around the village causing all this chaos and taking things, and you play as Saberman, and you've got to use your abilities to reach the wolf and take the things back, and then make your way to the exit before the wolf gets you. You've got all these animal partners that can help you, and you can use them as trampolines or as just floating platforms, however that works. I think a dragon can do more than just be a platform, Saberman. But I just find this game so interesting. Microsoft allowed Rare to bring back a franchise that hasn't been touched in 20 plus years on the Game Boy Advance, and it didn't have any future, but it was pretty good for what it was. And yeah, Saberwolf has never been touched again, apart from being in Killer Instinct. And we can't talk about Rare games on the Game Boy Advance without talking about its Mr. Pants. Mr. Pants appeared in a few Rare games and was somewhat becoming an icon of the company, but he never had his own game. Rare were developing a game called Donkey Kong Coconut Crackers, but then they were acquired by Microsoft, and so this game became its own original franchise. Its Mr. Pants is a puzzle game. All you have to do is take the shapes you've got and match them with what's on the screen to make complete rectangles, and this just causes this really cool burst of chains. The gameplay isn't anything revolutionary, but it is pretty fun, and it comes with a really crazy presentation where there's like animal noises when you clear boxes, and just like, what even is Mr. Pants? What are we looking at here? I don't know, but I like this game.
So, the Game Boy Advance had a pretty good Xbox life, mainly held up by Rare. But what if I told you that this guy here, the DS, had even more Xbox games, and barely any of them were done by Rare? Would you believe me? Well, be prepared to believe!
Pretty early on with the Xbox 360, Microsoft were quite competitive in trying to get Japanese games on the console, and so we had games like Lost Odyssey and Blue Dragon. And while Lost Odyssey absolutely rocked and Blue Dragon was pretty good, they kind of just stopped there. Apart from they didn't, because the Nintendo DS had 2 Blue Dragon games. This one here is Blue Dragon Plus, a real-time strategy game. This takes place after the main game, and you can touch on anyone in your party and tell them exactly where to go and who to attack. And there's a bunch of strategy in using the environment to your advantage, and using different characters to take on different scenarios. It's just a lot of fun, and I always love seeing sprites on a 3D board. I don't know why, it just looks nice. There's some twists in here too, like these robots have shadows. How's that possible? Play more to find out, viewer. And on the other end, we had Blue Dragon Awakened Shadow, which was a bit more traditional, but still quite a bit different to the original. Instead of being a turn-based RPG, this is now a real-time RPG, and the combat here is pretty good. You make your own character, this is Jonette, and you make friends with the Blue Dragon crew. Everyone in the world has their shadow taken away from them, but because you were underground during that moment, you're the only one left with a shadow, but you have the ability to give shadows back to those fighting with you. Definitely feels a lot more high stakes than the first DS Blue Dragon, and it's pretty ambitious too, with these full-on 3D environments and 3D character models, but I do just kinda wish it was turn-based like the first game and felt more like a proper, full-on sequel. But if you love Blue Dragon, there are 2 more games waiting to be played. Speaking of 2 more games, the DS also has 2 Age of Empires games. And what's crazy about these is instead of just trying to put Age of Empires on the DS, they instead just took the concept of Age of Empires, but changed the gameplay entirely to be Advance Wars. I mean this very literally. Both of these games are Advance Wars. Age of Empires: The Age of Kings takes most of its content from Age of Empires 2: The Age of Kings, which makes sense given they have the same title, but Advance Wars is everything. You go around on a turn-based grid, eventually you change to another day and it's the enemy's turn, you can use terrain to your advantage, you can use different enemy types which have advantages and disadvantages against them. It is Advance Wars, there's nothing more to explain with this. The Age of Kings is a very ambitious game, but it also doesn't run particularly well, it just kind of feels slow. Whereas Mythologies is a lot more optimized to the DS, though the scenarios aren't quite as polished, and there are some inaccuracies with the mythology, which is just kind of funny. But if you like Age of Empires, and you like Advance Wars, then you should probably play these 2, it's just kind of a no-brainer. And speaking of duologies again, we also have 2 Zoo Tycoon games on the DS, and this first one here is pretty damn awful. First up, it's kind of a sequel to Monster Truck Madness on the GBA, and by that I mean there's no music. Just silence. Let's play the quiet game again, viewer. Who will win? The interface is pretty bad as well. It spans across 2 screens, but you can't just touch where you want things to go. Instead, there's more of this sort of blueprint view on one screen and then the actual view on the other one. I'm not entirely sure why all the information wasn't just in one place. It feels clunky, it's not particularly good looking, it's very quiet because there's no music. This is just kind of a bad take on Zoo Tycoon. But Zoo Tycoon 2 is mildly better. There's music for one. Pretty good music too. Listen to that. And look, you can place things on the mandatory environment screen in real time without just mixing between both screens. Like this is good. This is good stuff. But it's also just kind of an average adaptation of Zoo Tycoon with a lot of the depth taken out. However, because this is the DS, you can pet animals. I don't think Zoo Tycoon quite found its footing on the DS, but like 2's at least an okay game. And speaking of duology, no, I'm joking, there's no more duos, but this one is MechAssault Phantom War. Yeah, MechAssault got a DS game, and you know what? It's pretty ambitious for the platform. This controls very similarly to Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker, where the face buttons dictate where you're aiming, whereas the D-pad lets you move around, but there's also a bunch of inputs on the touchscreen as well. You can get out of your mech, hack things, change your weapon type. It feels a bit like a dashboard on the screen here, which is just really cool. Now, is this one of those games that's more technically ambitious than it is pure fun? Kinda. There is still some fun to be had, but it doesn't rival the console Mecha Assault. It's not even really close. But it was very cool for this franchise to get just one last echo before fading away into total obscurity. But Mecha Assault 1 and 2 on the Xbox, amazing games. And Mecha Assault Phantom War, a decent game. And you know what? Let's do another duology. A duology of rare games. We had Viva Pinata Pocket Paradise. Viva Pinata makes a ton of sense as a handheld experience, just being on the go, building your garden, making it all nice and big, and just slowly chopping away at it until you build a utopia for all your pinata friends. And while this does fail to come close to the 360 version, it's still a decent game in itself. The fundamentals are mostly here, and the touch inputs work really well, but the scale is put down quite considerably. I wouldn't see this as a replacement version to the 360 game, it's more of a companion if you love that version and want to take it around with you in a smaller capacity. It's good for what it is. But we also had Diddy Kong Racing DS, the last time Microsoft allowed Rare to return to a Nintendo franchise. This is basically a full-on remake of the N64 game, and all the Xbox characters have just been pulled out. There's no Conker, there's no Banjo. And it's pretty loyal otherwise. Things still pretty much control as you'd expect. There's carts, there's boats, there's planes, the tracks are the same. But there's a few things that I don't quite love. I don't love how in order to get a boost at the start of the race, you have to sort of rev up on the touchscreen, because then when the race starts, you've got to like leave the touchscreen and go back to the controls. It's just kind of, it's a weird, disjointed boost. And they also replaced the coin searching with this balloon tapping mini game, and it doesn't control particularly well. Basically, whenever this game tries to do something new, it generally doesn't work very well. But the core racing in itself does work well, and this game also introduced online play, which was huge back in the day. When it comes to replaying Diddy Kong Racing, I always go back to the N64 version, but still, there is some value in here. It's not the total mess you may have heard it was. Like, yes, there are some bad parts, but still, Diddy Kong Racing with online play is generally a win. And I think we can count the Virtual Console. Over on Wii, we only received 3 games from Rare: Donkey Kong Country 1, Donkey Kong Country 2, and Donkey Kong Country 3. And what's bizarre is later in the Wii's life, these were delisted. It caused a bunch of conversations about whether Nintendo can just re-release Donkey Kong Country when they want, or whether they require Microsoft and Rare's permission. But yeah, this was all the Wii received. The Wii U, on the other hand, did get Donkey Kong Country 1, 2, and 3 back, in addition to the only release thus far of Donkey Kong 64, as this is still not on the Switch, but I imagine it will be in the future. It may even be if you're watching this video in the future, let me know. And lastly, the 3DS got the Donkey Kong Land trilogy, 1, 2, and 3. So all of Rare's Donkey Kong games can seemingly be re-released, but with the Switch, something far more ambitious happened. Rare games that Nintendo does not own. And when you view them on NSO, it even says, Xbox Game Studios made this. The first one was Banjo-Kazooie. And of course, just being Nintendo Switch Online games, these are just N64 ROMs, these haven't been touched at all. They still have Nintendo in the intro, this isn't an XBLA version, it is what it is, and it's fine for being what it is. Jet Force Gemini also came along, another Xbox Game Studio title, and it's one of the few games on NSO that supports widescreen, so bye-bye ugly grey borders, although this one is kind of letterboxed rather than being full-screen widescreen. But you know what, I like Jet Force Gemini. I think it's given a bad rep, but I think it's a cool game. And then lastly we have GoldenEye by Nintendo. Yeah, GoldenEye's always been quite complicated with its rights, but this thing could only release because Xbox also got their own version as part of Rare Replay. Much like Jet Force Gemini, this also supports widescreen, just like it did on the N64, and with the nature of NSO, you can finally play GoldenEye online from a console. And it definitely depends on who you're playing with, but I've had some pretty good experiences with those playing in the same country as me. There will surely be more Rare games to come, like Banjo-Tooie and Blast Corps, and maybe even Conker. But for now, those are the 3 non-DK games on NSO. But there's still more games to talk about! Minecraft! Microsoft acquired the Minecraft IP in 2014, but instead of keeping everything exclusive, they decided to embrace its multi-platform nature, and so Minecraft has been on basically every main console since the acquisition. It's been on PlayStation Vita, PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, Wii U, new 3DS, and the Switch. In fact, on Nintendo, there's even a Mario pack, with Mario skins, all these big Mario environments. It's really neat. Minecraft was also one of the big games to push crossplay, and back then, PlayStation were not playing ball, so there were all these commercials about Nintendo and Microsoft being best friends, while Sony were just kind of left in the corner. Eventually, Sony did give in, and so Minecraft can be played crossplay on PlayStation, but this was a big game to really push that initiative and make crossplay more of an industry-wide standard, so this was very important. Of course, this also led to Minecraft Dungeons and Minecraft Story Mode going to other platforms as well. Psychonauts 2 on PlayStation 4 is a very interesting one, as Double Fine were acquired by Microsoft after their crowdfunding of Psychonauts 2, so a PlayStation 4 version was pretty much just promised. In fact, PS4 was kind of the focus for a while. There was a Psychonauts 2 VR game as kind of a prequel to 2, and of course Microsoft didn't get that. But when you boot up Psychonauts 2, you actually do get an Xbox Game Studios logo, which is something that Minecraft never has. The only way to see Microsoft in Minecraft is to sit through the credits for a very long time, until eventually, Microsoft Game Studios is on the Nintendo 3DS, baby! Up until this point, when Xbox started putting their games on other platforms, they would hide their name. It was always, oh, Konami published this, or THQ published this, or Mojang made this, not Microsoft. But from here, they embraced Xbox Game Studios, and I think the biggest titles to really push that were the Ori ones. Ori and the Blind Forest landed on Nintendo Switch, very proudly published by Xbox Game Studios, and it even had Xbox Live support. You could sign in as your Xbox Live account and earn achievements. I've long said that Ori and the Blind Forest is one of my favorite Xbox One games, and it still is today, and the Switch version is just so beautiful. It runs fantastically, it works great on a handheld. If you've not played Ori, then go ahead, pick it up on the Switch. This is one of the best places to play Ori. And that stands for Will of the Wisps as well, which is also a crazy ambitious game. It may not look like it, but Will of the Wisps is full of 3D elements and so many layers to all these environments, and the fact that it manages to hold a pretty steady clip on the Switch while looking this good, it's nothing short of amazing. The optimization here is absolutely wild, and yes, this is another Xbox Game Studios game. Where it gets a little bit foggy is in the games that Microsoft helped release but don't actually own. So one of them is Cuphead. That was partially funded by Microsoft, and in the indie world where it was announced for Switch, they said this.
You can thank Studio MBHR for making their award-winning game so special, and our friends at Microsoft for helping us bring Cuphead to even more players.
So, clearly Microsoft assisted in Cuphead coming to Switch and PS4, and the same goes for Super Lucky's Tale as well. All of this started because Microsoft didn't have a handheld, and so they thought it was fine to put games on the GBA and the DS, but in recent years, they've just been putting their smaller Xbox games on multiple platforms, and they see no problem with that. This has been happening on a smaller scale for years now, and back in the early 2000s, a pretty gigantic scale. Age of Empires 2 was on PS2, but not Xbox. How do you explain this? Oh, and Microsoft embraced Super Smash Bros. As well, with playable fighters and costumes. We've got Banjo and Kazooie as playable fighters, we've got Steve from Minecraft, and then we've got Doom costumes and Fallout costumes and Elder Scrolls costumes and Spirits as well with Cuphead, and there's just so many other things in there. Even Amiibo, like turn Banjo over, and it says Microsoft.
And that is around 30 games that Microsoft have put on other platforms. Now granted, many of them were made specifically for handhelds, but in recent years, we've been seeing games like Ori and the Blind Forest and Ori and the Will of the Wisps, so it will be no surprise when we see games like Pentiment or Hi-Fi Rush make their way to other platforms. In fact, I think they're pretty much guaranteed at this point. So what do you think about this history of Xbox putting their games on other platforms, and what are you expecting from the future? Will it just be 4 games, or will it be many more? I think we all know it's probably going to be many more. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time. Bye, everyone.